The Sega Game Gear is perhaps the most underrated handheld in video game history. I love the Game Gear so much. I actually, I didn't grow up back then, so I didn't, get to experience it during its prime, but I did get to pick up a Sega Game Gear about 12 years ago, so around 2009. Back then, I was really into collecting video game consoles and handhelds from the past, and I was especially interested in Sega hardware because I grew up with Sonic the Hedgehog as a kid. Sonic Heroes on the PlayStation 2 is one of the first video games I have ever played, and since then, I absolutely fell in love with the Sonic franchise. Sonic Heroes, Sonic Riders, Shadow the Hedgehog. There really weren't a lot of Sonic games on PS2. The Sonic Adventure games were on GameCube, but not PlayStation 2, so I didn't get to experience those games until I actually bought a Sega Dreamcast to play the original games. And I remember having so much fun with my Dreamcast, even though I didn't get it until 2009, 10 years after its release. It still felt like a modern gaming system, as weird as that may sound. Like, it aged a lot better than I would have ever thought. So, me being so happy with my experience on the Dreamcast, I wanted to do the same thing with the Game Gear, because that was Sega's biggest handheld. Even though it wasn't very successful, there were a lot of games available on that system, and in 2009 I was able to get 3 Sega Game Gears and 15 games for $10 total. I don't know how much a Sega Game Gear costs now. I don't know if they've gone up in price or if they're still dirt cheap, but I found that very interesting that I was able to get 3 systems and a whole bunch of games for only $10. So, I gave away the 2 other Game Gears because I didn't need 3 systems. I gave away one of them to my sister and the other to my cousin, but they didn't really get to do much with it because I kept all the games for myself. I think my sister was still living with me back then, so I let her borrow a few games like The Lion King. She was a huge Lion King fan. She watched the movies back then when they came out, and she didn't know that there was a Lion King video game, so she loved that on the Game Gear. And I also had baseball games, sports games. There was also Ren and Stimpy on the Sega Game Gear. Anyone remember that cartoon back in the day? Yeah, there was a video game for that also. But my absolute favorite games to play on that system were definitely the 8-bit Sonic games. I had every single one of them that were ever released on the Game Gear because that's what came with the system, and I fell in love with the Sonic games on Game Gear. I love them so much, and this might sound crazy, but I actually preferred the 8-bit Sonic games over the ones on the Genesis because I had the Sega Mega Collection on PS2. It had all the Genesis games and a whole bunch of Sonic games from back in the day. And I don't know. I like the 8-bit games a lot more. Maybe because it had less technology. They couldn't really do as much with it. So Sonic had to move a little bit slower. And the pacing wasn't as fast as the Genesis games. I actually think that worked very well because I actually think that the 16-bit games were too fast because you were just going in loops, going just fucking way too fast that it was hard to keep up with it, and there were so many cheap deaths as a result. If you didn't memorize the entire fucking stage, you were gonna fall into a pit of death, and it wouldn't be your fault because you can't see anything that's in front of you. You're just looping around, and it feels more like a tech demo than an actual platformer, right? So I actually prefer the Sonic games on the Game Gear, which were also ported over to the Master System, I believe. And I remember right after I got my Game Gear, I brought it to school one day because during lunch period, you were allowed to have handheld systems with you. Everyone had their Tamagotchis and their Nintendo DSs, PSPs. I had my Sega Game Gear, and everyone was just looking at me like, what the hell is that? But they were intrigued. They were really interested, and they wanted to play games on it because they actually thought it was really cool. Unlike that story I told when I was in summer camp and I brought the Game Boy Pocket to camp with me, everyone was laughing at me and was making fun of me. But when I brought the Game Gear to school in 5th grade, all the kids around me, they actually thought that it was cool that I brought it to school. And I let everyone take turns and play it. So yeah, I actually have a lot of great memories with my Game Gear, even though I wasn't even alive when it was released. It was 10 years before I was born that this thing came out. And it's just crazy how you have a system that has so many great games, but it didn't even scratch the surface. It didn't even come close to matching the Nintendo Game Boy at the time, and is ultimately considered to be a failure. From its launch in Japan in 1990 till its discontinuation in 97, the Sega Game Gear only sold about 10 million units worldwide, which is pretty bad. So yeah, I guess it's a failure. What I find kind of funny, though, is that if you look on the Wikipedia page of the Sega Game Gear, it lists some reasons why the Game Gear didn't do so well, And two of those reasons is that it had a short battery life, and it was too big to be a portable system. I found that to be kind of funny, because look what we have now. We have the Nintendo Switch, which is technically one of the best-selling handhelds of all time. It's the second best behind only the Nintendo DS. I know it's a hybrid system, but still, like, the big selling point of the Switch is that you can take it on the go, right? So I find it funny how the Nintendo Switch is not much smaller than the Game Gear. I don't think it's actually smaller than the Game Gear at all. And the battery life is just as bad, only 2 hours on the base model Switch. I know they've improved it over time with later models, but still. For a system that came out in 2017, the Switch's battery life was downright pathetic. So, I don't know, I find that kind of interesting that people in history look back at the Game Gear being too big to fit in your pocket, and the battery life being way too short to be a viable handheld system. But fast forward 30 years or so, and we have the Nintendo Switch. So, I'm not exactly sure why the Sega Game Gear was such a failure. I mean, it wasn't, like, a complete disaster like other things Sega has made, like the 32X and the Sega CD. Sega did make more money off of the Game Gear than the Dreamcast, but it doesn't say much since the Dreamcast wasn't on the market for that long. But in 1990, to have a handheld system in full color, unlike the Game Boy, which was just black and white, gray, whatever the fuck you want to call it, green tint, the Game Gear was actually very impressive from a technological standpoint. Full color in 1990 for a handheld? I still laugh my ass off when I look back at that Game Gear commercial from back in the day, where this little fat kid is sitting in the park, and he doesn't like the fact that the Game Boy is, you know, you can't actually have color on it, so he whacks himself in the head and gets all dizzy so he can finally see color on the Game Boy. I thought that's one of the greatest commercials in video game history. But I guess with the Game Boy, it was cheaper, it had you know, Mario and all that shit. Like, Nintendo at that point was a well-established brand in the video game industry, so they were able to capitalize off the success of the NES and translate that into the handheld market. At the same time, Sega did have the Genesis / Mega Drive, but Sega was not able to get the people that were buying their consoles to also buy Game Gears. And maybe it didn't matter what Sega did. It didn't matter how Sega would try to market it. It didn't matter what games the Game Gear would have. People were just not willing to spend almost $300 because it launched for about $150, but in today's money, that would translate into $300. People are not willing to spend that much on a handheld system and have to worry about replacing 6 AAA batteries. I think that was a bit too much to ask for at that time. But the Game Gear was a system that was truly ahead of its time. People thought it was cool in the late 90s that the Game Boy had a little camera that you could take pictures and print shit out of. The Game Gear had a TV antenna that you can plug into the cartridge slot and literally have a portable TV in your hands. As far as I know, that doesn't work anymore because now the signals are digital. I think that happened back in 2009. So since then, you're no longer able to use the TV tuner, but back then, it was really fucking cool. Unfortunately, Sega didn't really see a lot of success with that handheld. But who knows, maybe if they waited like 3 or 4 years and they had a much smaller system that took less batteries and was just a better system overall, it was cheaper. Because, I mean, it wasn't until, 1998 that Nintendo even bothered releasing a colored handheld. So maybe, you know, it would have been beneficial for Sega to wait a little bit longer. But I guess they wanted to get in on the ground floor and release that colored handheld to market early, but I guess the timing just wasn't right. Very underrated system.